Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining today's PTI webinar. Today's speaker is Julianne Hull. Julianne is an expert in vendor oversight and management, and she's a frequent trainer for PTI on these topics. Today she will be speaking about risk management and clinical outsourcing. She'll be speaking for pretty much the full time we have today, so about 30 minutes. If there is time at the end, she may be able to answer a few of your questions. So if you do have questions, submit them in the questions tab and we will get to them if at all possible. I'll now hand over to you, Julianne.
Thank you, Roisin, and welcome everyone who's on the phone. I don't know where you are, but I hope you're having a sunny day and that there's few risks for you in your life today. So, risk when outsourcing. Now, people for years have discussed what risks are, looked at risks whenever they're running clinical trials, and it's become more and more popular for people to have risk management plans for their clinical trial or for their programs. But risk management for outsourcing is something that is still relatively new, although it's very important, and with the increase in outsourcing, it's extremely important. So what we're going to have a quick look at today, and it is only short and quick, in 30 minutes you can only cover at the high level, is risk management for outsourcing, risk identification, risk impact mitigation through risk management, and risk management plan. At the very end, we'll just talk a little bit about how you'll get a risk management plan together. And I think the message is risks are everywhere, but we can't identify all risks up front. We can't mitigate for all risks because there are many things that are just out of your control. But when we're outsourcing, we know we've selected one or more vendors to deliver whatever it is you've outsourced to them, whether it's contract manufacturing, clinical research, data management, medical writing. You know that you've outsourced something to a third party that, although you may have a contract with them, in fact you will have a contract with them, you don't know what the additional risks are whenever you outsource. And I would suggest that it's a good idea to start thinking about that and identify risks for outsourcing as well as risks for the project, and even to think of doing it jointly, you as sponsor with your service providers. Now, if a nuclear bomb goes off, I don't know that you can mitigate for that if you're running a clinical trial, but you can think, is there a risk if we run the clinical trial in a country which looks politically to be very unstable? Do we really need that country? Could we go elsewhere? What would be the approach to mitigate that risk, whether it is to have a backup country or just not use the country at all? But what does that mean with regards to outsourcing? Whenever you're outsourcing, is the CRO that you're working with also thinking there's a risk in that country? So working through what you think the risks are is not as easy or straightforward as it should be. But once you start doing it, then as you get more experienced at what risks matter and what don't, then you can continue doing it. And as you learn and as you work with other vendors and other colleagues, then you can find that risk management isn't so difficult. So what are the principles of management? I mean, very simple principles. What is it you're doing? You're outsourcing a project to a service provider. What are the risks of outsourcing to a service provider? Are they financially stable? So if we take are they financially stable as a risk? How would you mitigate that risk? Probably the best way to mitigate it is to use a different service provider. But if your CRO is financially stable when you select them, so you understand the risk, they're financially stable when you select them, but something happens and suddenly their finances change, perhaps because of some pulled contracts, perhaps because a big sponsor has gone through an acquisition and they're not being used anymore and it's made an impact on them. Well, that isn't something that you can necessarily plan for, and it's not necessarily something that you would identify as a risk at the beginning unless there was rumors in the press about the risk on the service provider. So the goal of risk management is identifying your risks, having some plan in place to mitigate that risk, and then to plan for the unexpected. And the unexpected is going to vary in the therapeutic area you're working with, the geography you're working in, the service providers you're working with, the sites you're working with, and outsourcing adds an additional complexity because you will have another company managing the people who are managing and working on your deliverables. So risk management is a formal process, and as we have looked at, just to summarize the last couple of slides, you identify your risks, you assess your risks, you plan how you would manage or mitigate them, and then you manage the whole process, and you keep doing that throughout your project. And I don't mean daily, but certainly if you've identified the risks at the beginning of the study, if you're outsourcing a clinical trial, once recruitment is over, your risks may change. And once, all countries are open, your risks may change. So it's a matter of being aware that what was a risk on day one may not be a risk 30 days, 60 days, 100 days later. Your service providers will almost certainly be looking at evaluating the risk for running the project, and their risks will not necessarily be the same as your risks. Your risks will be, can the CRO deliver on time, on quality, and with the cost we've agreed? And that is on top of, are there any risks in running this particular project? Your CRO will look at, can they run the project for you? Will they give you an acceptable deliverable? Are you going to give them the repeat business if they do a good job? But they'll also be looking at, is there a risk to their profit? And is that a risk that they're going to take on this project or on a different project? If you're a new client, will they take a risk on their profit to aim to deliver well so that you think, yes, this is a service provider I want to provide, I want to give repeat business to. So risk when outsourcing is going to be very similar for the project, but the outsourcing aspects will be different for the sponsor and for the service provider. So what do you do to identify your risks? Brainstorm, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. Having identified your risks, what are you going to do with your risks? If you look at the pictorial image, you'll look at how likely is the risk to occur. Is it a low likelihood? or is it a high likelihood? And then if the risk does occur, does it have a high impact or a low impact? And if you take this simplistic approach, then you can look at what risks you should be paying attention to at the different times during the project deliverable. Is of low impact, doesn't affect the critical path, is unlikely to happen, you can pretty much forget about it. If it has a medium impact, then how likely is it to occur, and do you need to mitigate for it? If it is a high impact, then you do need some planning, particularly if there's a high likelihood it will occur. So one of the things that often worries us in clinical trials is patient recruitment. And patient recruitment will have a high impact on your clinical trial. How do you mitigate for that? Well, the usual way of mitigating it is to bring on new countries or new sites. So what does that mean when you're outsourcing? Can your CRO go to those countries? Is the first thing. And looking at the project as a whole, if you go to those countries, how long is it going to get improvement? If you have your backup country as one that has a long regulatory process, that really isn't something that is going to have a quick impact to reduce your risks and to mitigate them. So it's a matter of thinking, what is your backup plan and does it make sense? In looking at your risks, you want to, and as everyone is extremely busy, you really want to ignore risks which have low impact and low likelihood, because that's just a waste of your time whenever you've got other things to think about. You've identified your risks, you've prioritized them. How do you mitigate for those risks? Do you have the authority to mitigate? Do you need to escalate the risk to somebody more senior who might approve budgets or who might approve how the CRO would go into another country for you? So as part of your mitigation, what is important is knowing how to reduce the risk of the risk you have identified and mitigating it appropriately in front. And in going to more senior management, you do need them to be aware that this is not something that has happened, that it is part of your project risk planning, that you are looking at ensuring that you have outsourced, that maybe you are outsourcing to a main CRO with 3 or 4 subcontractors. There is a lot of complexity in there, and that you may need some support to deal with certain risks. For example, if one of the subcontractors has poor performance, although the subcontracted service provider is contracted by your main service provider, you as the sponsor are still important. You as the sponsor are still ultimately responsible. So you need to be involved in looking and managing and thinking of the contingency, and in fact being part of the solution if that risk actually matures into something that is an issue. So common areas of risk, and I could give loads of these, but we're talking about outsourcing. So geography is important. Work scope. Does the service provider understand the scope of work? Is that clear? Has the scope started to change? Vendor performance. Have you had some turnover in staff? Is your key project manager at the service provider delivering, or have they resigned and you've got a new project manager coming in? Where are the risks there? But again, in looking at risks, if you look at the bottom right hand of the slide, there's force majeure, the risk that is out of your control. And being aware you can't mitigate or manage for everything is really important. So you've got an outsourcing. Who's going to do the risk management? And it does depend on how you've set things up and how big you are. If you're a very small company, a startup company with only a couple of people, then perhaps that is something that you will delegate totally to the service provider. But if you are medium plus size sponsor, then my suggestion would be that risk management is something you need to do as a sponsor and something you need to jointly do with your service provider. So as a sponsor, you will look at what are the risks to you for outsourcing, whereas jointly with your service provider, you can look at what are the risks for the deliverable. And these are your regular project risks, but the service provider will have a different perspective. Because you've outsourced it, you may not be as close to all of the risks in your project. So if you can perform risk management of the project jointly with your service provider, then you are more likely to have successful risk management. And on top of this, your service provider will be doing risk management and working with you. Are you a sponsor that keeps changing their mind and keeps changing the scope of the project so that they're really not quite sure how to resource for it? Are you a sponsor that refuses to have any changes in scope even though you've asked them to go to 3 new countries? And is that a risk that the CRO is prepared to take or not, depending on what your contract up front was? So, the risks are all over the place, but the key thing is you have risks as a sponsor whenever you outsource, and that is associated with outsourcing. The service provider has risks in working with you, whether you'll pay them on time, whether you're a difficult sponsor that are going to lead to trouble, whether you're a very easy sponsor to work with is a different risk. And jointly, you can benefit by using the broader knowledge of the project to identify the risks. And then whenever you're working through the project, you need to do ongoing risk management. So I would suggest that risk management of the project is something that if you have regular study team meetings with the service provider, you may want to have on the agenda, say monthly, just to have a quick review to see if any risks have disappeared, if any have manifested, and if any new ones have arisen, arisen rather, and if there's been any change in the status of previous risks. And this is something that you need to keep doing throughout your outsourced project. So that, what really are we talking about? Things don't turn out as expected. And they rarely do whenever you're running clinical trials. So you need to build some contingency in there and try to identify your risks up front, have a plan, and work with your service providers on the joint risks for the project deliverable. At this stage, I would normally say, are there questions of people thinking associated with risks? But what I will say is the biggest impact that I'm aware on multiple clinical trials is not necessarily where people would have thought it would have been. So I think whenever we're outsourcing, we'll think if we're going into new geographic regions, particularly in Asia, where although clinical research is becoming more frequent, it is not as mature as it is in the West. And yet my understanding is that the biggest impact on clinical trials, on a global clinical trial, were actually whenever there was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, where the cloud was not something that was really used at all then, and quite a few sites were destroyed, and a lot of clinical research data and source data was lost. That risk has probably decreased in the US due to cloud technology and the use of electronic medical records. And why did it happen in the US? Probably because so many clinical trials happen there that the risk of something like a weather disaster impacting the clinical trial was more likely to happen in the US, where there were multiple clinical trials. And that, I don't think, is a risk that we would have thought about up front. So we're, I think, 20 minutes into the seminar, and I'm going to finish quickly on what you need to think about having in a risk management plan. And I will skip through this quite quickly because we're trying to cover a lot in our half hour. But you've defined your project, you know what you think your project is. Knowing your project, do you know the components of risk? You know, what are the events? What could happen? How likely is it to happen? How bad will it be if it does happen? Can you reduce the chance of it happening? Can you reduce the impact if it does happen? And is working through some form of mitigation worth it from the cost benefit viewpoint? Management plan, start off and brainstorm risks and list them. And some will be real risks, some you'll you know, say these aren't risks at all for this particular time that we are outsourcing this project. But brainstorm them as a sponsor and then jointly with your service provider so that you can get the benefits of their knowledge. Having identified the risk, look at them and analyze them. What are the consequences of those risks and if they occur? I mean, for example, try to be as specific as possible so that if a risk does come to fruition, you've already identified some plans and you already know what the cost impact could be. Whenever you're looking at the consequences of each risk, look at them as high, medium or low. And if the risk is very low, remove it. Forget about it. And forgetting about it means that you eliminate irrelevant risks. Things out of your control like Hurricane Katrina or political unrest. Tabulate your risks versus likelihood and consequences. Rank the risks. What do you think is most likely to happen and what isn't? What does it actually make business sense to mitigate for? Some risks you just have to live with because you're not going to be able to do anything about it. You just have to hope it doesn't happen, like Hurricane Katrina. And during the study, have a risk management log. So for example, I put here the CRO was unable to find qualified CRAs in 3 of your countries. If that happened, it would have a high impact on your study. You've currently assessed it as medium likelihood, and the risk owner is the project manager at the service provider. And as sponsor, you will work with the CRO for solutions, and you do have the option of subcontracting if necessary if there's a problem in a country. And this risk management log can then go on to be an issue log if it becomes an issue. So it is a way of seeing what risks become issue. With that knowledge of the trial and the outsourcing, then you can learn for your next trial, your next project, whenever you're outsourcing. Developing mitigation strategies for your top selected risks. But again, only for those that you can mitigate for, but just some way of reducing the risk occurring. So if we're outsourcing, the first thing is, does the vendor understand their mission? Do they know what you've asked them to do? And that starts at selection of the vendor, and it starts at your bid defense meeting. So that is something you can mitigate by listening, questioning. But you've selected your vendor, they're doing a great job, but you've got a concern because you know that everything hangs on their very expert project manager. How are you going to mitigate if that project manager is promoted or leaves, is sick? What are the plans in place so that you can work with your service provider to mitigate? And looking through everything, monitor and review your risk management plan. Having identified your risks, identified the consequences of the risks, eliminated any irrelevant risks, and tabulated them so you can prioritize them, you need to review the risks in the risk management plan on a regular basis. And I would suggest that should be no less frequently than once a month. But it is going to depend on the project and where you are in the project.